They told Gideon Rourke he was making the worst mistake of his life. Every man in Red Hollow said the same thing. Don't hire that woman. Don't let Elara Quinn anywhere near your land, your livestock, your future. She's cursed, they said. Bad luck walking on two legs. For 3 years she'd been invisible in this town, and they wanted her to stay that way. But Gideon was 9 days from losing everything, and he was running out of options. So he hired her anyway. Neither of them knew that decision would burn the whole rotten system down. Like this video, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The notice was handwritten, which told Elara everything she needed to know about the man who'd posted it. Most ranchers in Red Hollow used the print shop on Caldwell Street for their hiring boards. Clean type, professional presentation, the kind of thing that said, I am a serious man with serious business. But this one was written in pencil on the back of what appeared to be a feed invoice, the handwriting cramped and slightly uneven, like someone who'd composed it in a hurry and didn't much care how it looked. Ranch hand needed, Iron Ridge, honest work, honest pay, no nonsense. And then a name, Gideon Rourke, with a rough map drawn below it showing the road north out of town, the fork past the dry creek bed and an X where she was supposed to turn. Elara read it twice. She'd been standing at the community board outside Hennessy's general store for nearly 10 minutes, reading and rereading the notices that had nothing for her, the ones that said no experience or inquire within, and then went quiet the moment she walked through the door. This was the 11th notice she'd read this week, the 4th time she'd walked away from this same board. She pulled the Rourke notice off the nail. The woman behind her in line at the store, May Tilson, who ran the seamstress shop and had made a career of knowing other people's business, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Elara turned. That's for ranch work, May said, as if clarifying something obvious. I know what it's for. Gideon Rourke's place. May said the name the way people in Red Hollow said most things about Elara. Carefully, like something that might be contagious. His ranch is in serious trouble from what I hear. You'd be walking into a sinking ship. Elara folded the notice and put it in her coat pocket. Then I'd better know how to swim. She didn't wait for a response. But the walk back to her rented room at the Callaway boarding house took 11 minutes if she went straight and didn't stop. Elara went straight and didn't stop. She had 9 days left on her current month's rent, which Mrs. Callaway had reminded her about twice this week already, once in passing in the hallway and once with a note slipped under the door. The note had been the worst of the two. Something about a written reminder felt more official, more final, like documentation of a problem that wasn't going away. 3 years in Red Hollow, and this was where she'd landed. One small room with a window that faced the alley, a bed, a table, a chair, and a trunk that held everything she owned. Not many things, but each one chosen. The field guide to cattle husbandry she'd bought secondhand from a man leaving for Oregon 3 years back. A ledger she'd filled with notes from every agricultural article she'd read in the county papers. 2 good work shirts and a pair of boots she'd resold herself twice. A photograph of her mother taken the year before she died, kept in the front cover of the ledger because that was where Elara was most likely to see it every day. She spread the Rourke notice on the table and looked at it in the afternoon light. She knew about Iron Ridge Ranch. Everybody did. Gideon Rourke had come to the territory about 6 years back with his wife, Clara, and had built the place from raw land, cleared it, fenced it, dug the wells, built the house, and the outbuildings himself with help from 2 hired men who'd moved on once the work was done. Clara had died in childbirth 3 years ago, the same winter Elara had arrived in Red Hollow. The baby hadn't survived either. After that, by all accounts, Gideon had run the ranch alone, worked himself near to the bone, and the drought that had crept across the county over the past 18 months had done to Iron Ridge what 3 years of hard work had been trying to prevent. The ranch was struggling. The man was struggling. And the town, which had watched and whispered and done absolutely nothing useful, had already written them both off. Elara looked at the map. The X was maybe 4 miles north. She could be there by late morning if she left at first light. She folded the notice back into her pocket, picked up her ledger, and started writing down what she already knew about drought management and cattle operations. She worked until the lamp burned low. She arrived at Iron Ridge a little after 9 the following morning. The ranch was not what she'd expected, which was to say it was better and worse simultaneously. The house was solid, good timber frame, carefully built, the kind of construction that took thought rather than just muscle. Someone had laid proper stone foundations. The fences along the road were in decent repair. But the land itself told a different story. The grazing pastures were stripped down to pale dirt and scrub, the creek that cut through the northern corner of the property showing only a thin thread of water where there should have been a proper flow. The cattle she could see from the road, maybe 30 head scattered across 2 pastures, were thin. Not starving, but thin in the way that said we've been asking more of this land than it can give right now. There was a man working near the barn when she rode in. He looked up before she'd even dismounted, which meant he'd heard her coming and hadn't come out to meet her, which meant he was either cautious or just busy. He was both, she'd learn. Gideon Rourke was not what Red Hollow's gossip had suggested. She'd heard the word broken used about him more than once. Broken since Clara died, broken by the drought, broken by debt. The man who turned from the fence post he'd been repairing was tired, yes. The tiredness was visible, in his shoulders and around his eyes. But broken wasn't the word. He had the look of someone who'd been hit hard and hadn't gone down, which was a different thing entirely. He was maybe mid-30s, broad in the shoulder, with dust on his shirt and a hammer still in one hand. He studied her without expression for a moment. "Alara Quinn?" he said. "That's right." He looked at the horse, then back at her. "You rode out from town this morning." "Left at first light. Your map was accurate." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, just a recalibration of expectation. He set the hammer on the fence post. "Come on then, I'll show you around." No welcome, no small talk, no questions about whether she'd eaten or had a comfortable trip. Alara respected that immediately. He showed her the operation with the efficiency of someone who'd done it alone too long. The cattle herd, 43 head, he said, down from 68 at the start of the year. He'd sold 25 in the spring when he'd thought selling early and saving on feed was the smart play, and it had been at the time. Now he wasn't sure. The pastures were overgrazed because he'd been rotating them wrong. He admitted that without her asking. Water was the core problem. The main well was holding, but the second well on the north pasture had dropped significantly. He was hauling water by bucket to the northern herd twice daily. "How long have you been hauling manually?" she asked. "About 6 weeks." "Alone?" "Mostly." She looked at his hands. The skin was cracked at the knuckles, the kind of damage that didn't happen from one bad week. "You need a second well on the north pasture. The one you have isn't going to recover this season." "I know that." "Have you talked to anyone about drilling?" "I know what it costs." She didn't push it. Not yet. She was mapping the problem, not solving it in the first hour. He showed her the barn, well kept, organized, which she noted as a good sign. A man who kept his barn organized generally kept his books in reasonable order too, and she needed to look at his books before she could do anything useful. He showed her the hay stores, which were lower than they should be for this time of year, and the equipment shed where a hay cutter sat with a broken blade he hadn't had time to repair. At the end of the tour, they stood in the yard outside the barn, and he looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived. "You've done ranch work before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My family had a farm. Before?" She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask. "I need to be straight with you," he said. "The ranch is in worse shape financially than the land shows. I have a mortgage with Crow Lending, and I'm behind on payments. I've got maybe 2 months before they can start foreclosure proceedings under the terms of the note." "How far behind?" 3 payments. "What's the note amount?" He named a number. It was serious, but not impossible, depending on variables she didn't know yet. "Can I see the books?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Most men in that situation either got defensive about their finances or tried to minimize. He just nodded and went into the house. The kitchen table became her desk for the next 3 hours. Gideon Rourke's financial records were the records of a careful man who'd been slowly overwhelmed. His ledgers were neat, consistently maintained. She could see the entries going back 6 years, the early years showing steady growth, modest profit, reinvestment back into the land. Then 2 years ago, the first signs of drought. Sales beginning to exceed purchases, which looked healthy on a page until you understood he was selling capital assets to cover operating costs. Then last year, the mortgage payments starting to fall behind. First 1 month, then 2. He'd made 1 catch-up payment in the fall, but it had cleaned out what little reserve he'd built, and the 2 payments since then had gone unpaid. Crow Lending. She'd seen that name on documents around Red Hollow. Silas Crow ran the lending operation out of the county seat, and he had his fingers in half the mortgages north of the river, from what she knew. She'd never had dealings with him personally, but she'd heard enough. "This catch-up payment in October," she said, turning the ledger toward him. He was sitting across the table with coffee he'd offered her and a cup he wasn't drinking. "You sold 12 head to make this payment." 13. The records show 12. One died in transport. Buyer docked me. She made a note. And then November and December went unpaid. Hay prices went up. I had to choose. He said it flat, not ashamed, not apologetic, just facts. "What's Crow's position on renegotiating terms?" The change in his expression was subtle but readable, a tightening around the jaw. "We've had 2 conversations. He's not interested in renegotiating." "Did he say why?" "He said his terms are his terms." Alara looked at the page. "Does he usually work that way? Or is he making an exception for you?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I've heard from 2 other ranchers east of here that he renegotiated their terms when they fell behind." She wrote that down too. "The other thing," Gideon said, and she looked up. "The town is going to tell you things about me taking you on. I know what they say about you, Quinn. I want you to know that's not... I don't operate that way. You either work or you don't. We'll know soon enough." It was the most personal thing he'd said. She appreciated that it wasn't an apology because she hadn't asked for one. "Then let's get to work," she said. The first week was a test, and she knew it. She didn't try to change everything at once. That was an amateur's mistake. Coming in with a reorganization plan and running it at full volume before you understood the nuances of a specific operation. Instead, she worked alongside Gideon through the existing routine, doing the hauling and the feeding and the fence repairs and the 100 other things that made up a ranch day. And she watched how the cattle moved, which ones were eating well and which weren't, how the herd distributed across the available pasture. Watched the soil in each section, color, moisture, the presence or absence of grass root structure. Watched Gideon too, not because she was analyzing him as a person, but because the way a rancher moved through his land told you everything about what he understood and what he'd missed. He was competent. That was clear. He knew cattle, knew his land, knew the mechanical requirements of running the operation. What he'd missed, understandably, given he'd been doing this alone and exhausted, was the larger pattern. He was managing crises individually rather than seeing how the crises connected. On the 4th day, she found the heifer. She was in the back corner of the east pasture running a fence line check when she spotted her, a 2-year-old lying flat in the shade of the fence, which wasn't necessarily wrong except that it was mid-morning and cool, not the kind of heat that sent cattle down for shade. Alara changed direction and crossed the pasture to her, and recognized the problem before she was 10 feet away. Milk fever. The heifer had calved recently. She could see the signs, and the calcium depletion had hit her hard. She went back to the barn at a controlled jog. Gideon was repairing the hay cutter. "Your east pasture heifer, back fence corner. She's down with milk fever," she said. "Do you have calcium borogluconate in the supply cabinet?" He set down the file he was using. "There should be a bottle, maybe 2. I need it now and I need your help." He was moving before she finished the sentence. They worked on the heifer together for the better part of an hour. The calcium injection, the careful monitoring, the patience required while the animal's system responded. Gideon knew what to do. He'd dealt with milk fever before, but having 2 people made it manageable rather than a crisis. The heifer was on her feet by noon, unsteady but standing, her calf nursing again by mid-afternoon. Gideon stood in the pasture watching the calf and didn't say anything for a while. "If she'd gone down overnight," Alara said, "you probably wouldn't have found her until morning. By then..." "I know." He paused. "I've been so focused on the water hauling, I've been doing fast pasture checks, not thorough ones. You're one person. I've been one person for 3 years." He said it without self-pity, more like reciting a fact he'd mostly made peace with. She looked at the calf. "Not anymore." By the end of the 2nd week, she'd put 3 changes in place. The first was the grazing rotation. Gideon had been running the herd on a 2-pasture rotation that was destroying both sections. She restructured it to 4 sections using temporary fencing. Cheap, fast, nothing elaborate. giving each parcel more recovery time between grazing. It wasn't a perfect solution with soil this depleted, but it slowed the damage immediately. The second was the water situation. She couldn't fix the north well, but she could reduce how much water was being hauled manually. She spent an afternoon on the road north of the ranch and found a low spot where runoff water had been pooling and evaporating uselessly. With 2 days of work and materials that cost less than a week of her pay, she and Gideon built a simple collection basin and ran pipe from it to a secondary trough in the north pasture. It didn't fully replace the well, but it cut the hauling time in half. The third was the hay cutter. She fixed it herself. The broken blade had a fracture that looked catastrophic, but was actually repairable with a weld. She'd learned metalwork the same way she'd learned most things, out of necessity. She borrowed the neighbor's forge and had the blade back in one afternoon. Gideon looked at it for a long moment when she showed him. "Where did you learn to weld?" "Same place I learned everything else, doing it until it worked." He didn't say anything right away. Then, "I would have left that blade for 6 months." "I know, it was on your list." He looked at her. "You've seen my list? You keep it on the same nail as the water schedule. It was hard to miss." Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it didn't quite arrive. "I'll move it." "Don't. It's in a logical place." 3 weeks in, she asked to see the full mortgage documents. They were in a metal box under the floorboard of the bedroom, which Gideon retrieved without comment and set on the kitchen table. Alara spread the papers out and read through them with the systematic attention she brought to everything. The original loan documents, the payment history, the formal notices of late payment, 2 of them, both from Crow Lending. She read the terms 3 times. "Gideon," she said, "come look at this." He came to the table and looked over her shoulder at the page she indicated. She'd marked a clause near the bottom of the second page, in language that was dense enough to make it easy to miss. "This acceleration clause," she said. "Crow can only invoke foreclosure proceedings if 3 consecutive payments are missed, and he provides 30 days written notice before filing." He sent the notices. He sent notices of late payment. That's different from the formal notice required under this clause. The formal notice has to reference this specific clause by number and be delivered in person or by registered mail. "Did you receive anything by registered mail?" Gideon thought about it. "No." "Then he hasn't formally started the clock yet. He's behind on his own procedure." Gideon stood looking at the document. She could see him recalibrating, the same expression she'd seen when she brought him the repaired hay blade. Not relief exactly, more like a man revising a calculation he'd thought was final. "That gives us time," she said. "Or it gives him time to send the notice." "Yes, but it also means if we can make even partial payment before he files the formal notice, the consecutive payment chain is broken and he has to restart his timeline." "I don't have the money for a partial payment. You have 8 cattle that can be culled and sold without compromising the core herd. If you move them in the next 2 weeks, you'll have enough to make 1 payment and file it against the oldest outstanding balance." He was quiet. "You've already run the numbers." "I ran them twice." Gideon sat down across from her, his hands flat on the table. He looked at the mortgage documents, then at her, with an expression that was hard to read in its complexity. There was something there she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly, more like the disorientation of someone who'd been carrying a weight alone for so long that the moment another person took part of it felt strange and unfamiliar. "Why are you still here?" he said. "What?" "In Red Hollow. You've clearly got... Why are you still in a place that treats you the way it does?" The question was direct enough that it deserved a direct answer. "Because leaving takes money and a destination. I've been working on both." "Fair enough." He looked back at the documents. "We'll cull the 8 and move them to Pryor's sale in Millhaven. 2 weeks. She nodded. "I'll have a full financial plan drawn up before then. Everything we can do in the next 60 days to keep Crow from getting a foothold." He was quiet for a moment. "You know he's not just being a hard-nosed lender. You understand that, right?" "I'm starting to," she said. "Tell me what you know." What Gideon knew, it turned out, was more than he'd initially offered. It came out gradually over the following days, not in one organized accounting, but in pieces. Things he'd heard, things he'd seen, a conversation with a neighboring rancher named Holt, who'd lost his property to Crow Lending 2 years ago and relocated his family to the Eastern Territories. Crow had a pattern. He targeted properties in the path of something. The new rail spur that the Territory Commission had been discussing for 3 years, a line that would run north from the county seat and potentially pass through or near the northern ranch lands. Land that was currently worth what drought-stricken farmland was worth, which wasn't much but would be worth considerably more if the rail came through. Crow had already acquired 3 properties in the corridor over the past 4 years, all through foreclosure or forced sale, all ranches that had gone underwater during the drought. Iron Ridge sat directly in the projected path. "How do you know about the rail line?" Ilara asked. "Clara's brother works for the surveying office. He mentioned it 2 years ago, said it was still preliminary. I didn't think much about it at the time." "Does Crow know you know?" "I never said anything to anyone." Ilara looked at her notes. The picture was forming. Not just a lender protecting a loan, a speculator engineering failures to acquire land cheap before a rail development that would multiply its value. The drought had given him cover. The ranchers going under looked like drought casualties. Nobody was looking at the pattern. She picked up her pencil and started a new page in the ledger. "I need access to the county land registry," she said. Gideon looked at her. "What are you planning?" "I'm not sure yet, but I want to look at his acquisition record. Every property he's taken in the last 5 years, when he took it, and what he paid. That's public record. You can get it at the courthouse in Mill Haven. Then when we take the cattle to Pryor's sale, I'll go to the courthouse first." He was quiet for a moment. Something in the set of his face suggested he was doing his own kind of calculation, adding her up, reconsidering the numbers. "Quinn," he said finally. "Yes. I'm glad you answered the notice. It wasn't much. It wasn't flowery or elaborate, but it came from somewhere real, and she could tell the difference. "Ask me again in 60 days, she said, "when we know if it worked." The 5th week marked a turn she hadn't anticipated. She'd been careful about distance. Not cold. She wasn't by nature cold, whatever Red Hollow had decided about her. But careful. Gideon's life was complicated, and her position in it was professional, and she'd seen enough situations collapse because someone had confused proximity for connection. She did her work. She ate the meals he cooked without making anything of the fact that he'd started cooking more of them. She sat with him in the evenings when the paperwork required it and went to her room. She was sleeping in the spare room, a practicality they'd both addressed matter-of-factly, when it didn't. But the 5th week, the heifer calved again. Not the one from the milk fever, a different animal in the middle of the night. And it was a difficult birth. Gideon knocked on her door at 3 a.m, already apologizing before she was fully awake. "Don't apologize," she said, pulling on her boots. "Give me 1 minute." They were in the barn until nearly 5, working in the lamplight in the way that difficult work sometimes creates its own intimacy. Not romantic, just human, the kind of closeness that comes from shared effort and shared worry. The calf made it. The mother was exhausted but stable. They sat on hay bales in the quiet afterward, while the barn settled around them, and the lamp threw long shadows, and the animal smell of warm hay and cattle was familiar and grounding. "Clara loved mornings like this," Gideon said quietly. "It came out the way things do when someone isn't quite talking to you, but isn't talking only to themselves. Said there was nothing better than knowing something was alive that had been fighting for its life an hour before." Ilara didn't fill the silence. She let it be what it was. "She was a good rancher," he said. "Better than me with the animals. I'm better with the land and the equipment. She was the one who could look at a sick cow and know what it needed before anybody else did. That's a real skill." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to run this place as if I could just work hard enough that her absence wouldn't matter. Like if I just did twice the work." He stopped. "That doesn't work, as it turns out." "No?" Ilara agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at her then, not with anything she needed to categorize or respond to, just looked, the way people do when they're recognizing something they hadn't seen before. "You're all right, Quinn," he said. She almost laughed, not unkindly. High praise. "Coming from me?" "Yes." And this time the smile did arrive, brief and slightly worn, but real. She looked at the calf in the lamplight. "Get some sleep when you can. We need to be in Millhaven by Thursday." "Don't." She found him the next morning in the yard before the sun was fully up. He was standing at the fence line looking north, coffee in hand, and he didn't turn when she came up beside him. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of early spring air that still had winter in it, and the land stretched out in the pale light toward the ridge that gave the ranch its name. "I've been thinking," he said, still looking north, "about Crow, among other things." He turned the cup in his hands. "I want you to know, and whatever happens with the ranch, with Crow, with all of it, I'm going to fight it. I'm not going to roll over. I need you to know that before we go to Mill Haven." "I know that," she said. "Do you? Because I've had 2 people in the past year suggest I should just negotiate a sale and move on, cut my losses. I'm not one of those people." He looked at her. "No, I can see that." She wrapped both hands around her own coffee. "Gideon, when we go to the courthouse, I'm going to look at land records that may tell us Crow is running something that isn't just hard dealing. If I find what I think I'm going to find, this gets more complicated before it gets simpler. I want you to be ready for that." He considered that for a moment, meaning he'll push back harder. Meaning when cornered men like Crow push back, they don't do it politely. He nodded, slowly. "Then I guess we better be ready for that too." The sun came up over the ridge then, slow and red, and the light caught the frost on the pasture grass and turned it briefly golden before it melted. It was a cold, clear morning, with hard work ahead and a harder fight coming, and Alara Quinn stood on land she'd been working for 5 weeks now, and felt something she hadn't felt in Red Hollow in 3 years. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Asim. They left for Mill Haven on Thursday at first light, the 8 cold cattle loaded in Gideon's trailer and the morning air still sharp enough to see their breath. Alara had the land registry request written out the night before, the specific names and dates she needed to search, the properties she suspected, the timeline she was building in her head. It wasn't proof yet, but she was going to find it. Red Hollow sat quiet behind them as they drove out. A few early risers on the street watched them pass without waving. Alara didn't look back. She was thinking about Silas Crow, and about patterns, and about the kind of careful documentation that made a man's scheme impossible to dismiss. She was thinking about the next 60 days, and about what it would take to win something that wasn't supposed to be winnable. And she was thinking, in a way she'd been trying not to examine too directly, about a man standing at a fence line in the cold morning light, turning a coffee cup in his hands and saying, "I'm going to fight it," with the conviction of someone who meant every word. She looked straight ahead at the road. There was work to do. The Mill Haven cattle sale ran out of a flat, dusty yard on the south end of town, where the smell of animals and sawdust mixed with the particular tension of men trying to get more than something was worth. Gideon worked the sale pen while Alara went to the courthouse, and they'd agreed to meet back at the truck by noon. She found the land registry office on the second floor of the county building, a room that smelled of old paper and wood varnish, staffed by a clerk who looked at her request form with the mild suspicion that clerks everywhere reserved for people who knew exactly what they were asking for. She'd written it out specifically: property acquisition records, Northern Corridor, past 6 years, any transactions involving Crow lending or Silas Crow personally as buyer of record. "That's a broad search," the clerk said. "I know. I'll wait." He brought her 3 bound ledgers and a folder of loose filings, set them on the reading table without comment, and went back to his desk. Alara sat down and opened the first ledger. It took her an hour and a half to build the picture clearly enough to trust it. 7 properties. That was the number. 7 separate land parcels acquired by Crow Lending, or a subsidiary entity called Northern Reach Holdings, a name that appeared on 2 of the later acquisitions, over the past 5 years. All in the corridor north of Mill Haven, all acquired through foreclosure proceedings or distress sales where Crow had been the lending party. The dates clustered interestingly: 3 in the first 2 years, then a gap, then 4 in the past 18 months. The drought had started 18 months ago. She copied the relevant entries into her ledger in careful detail: property descriptions, acquisition dates, the names of the families who'd lost the land, the recorded sale prices. The prices were the part that mattered most. Every acquisition had gone through at assessed drought-depressed values, which was legal. But the cluster of them, the pattern of the same lender appearing as both the mortgage holder and the eventual buyer of record in each case, with no auction process documented, no competitive bids, that was something else. That wasn't just hard dealing. That was a system. She was still writing when she heard the clock on the wall read noon, then 12:15, then 12:30. She didn't stop until she had everything she needed copied and double-checked. Gideon was at the truck when she got there, leaning against the hood with his arms folded, the look of a man who'd done his transaction and was turning it over in his head. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Better than I hoped. Pryor's buyer took all ye 8 at a fair price. We've got enough to cover one full payment with a little left over." "Good. Send it by registered mail to Crow's office today. Keep the receipt." He looked at her. "Why registered mail?" Because it creates a dated record of receipt that he can't dispute. If he claims he never received it, the registry shows otherwise. We're building a paper trail as carefully as he has." She set her ledger on the hood of the truck. "Sit down. I need to show you something." He looked at the pages she opened to, and she walked him through it methodically. The 7 properties, the dates, the subsidiary company name, the pricing pattern. She watched his face as he read, the particular stillness that came over him when he was processing something that confirmed a suspicion he'd had but hadn't been able to name. "Northern Reach Holdings," he said, "registered in the territory capital 18 months ago. Same month the drought officially got classified as a regional emergency. Right when land prices started dropping. Right when a man who already knew the rail survey corridor bought himself a shell company to make the purchases harder to trace back to him directly." She tapped the final entry. "This last acquisition, the Mercer property, east of yours, it went through 3 months ago. The Mercers had 2 payments outstanding. Crow didn't wait for a third." Gideon's jaw tightened. He pushed them out faster than the terms allowed. The terms allowed it under a different clause than the standard one. He'd written a harsher acceleration provision into the Mercer note than into yours. Different terms for different borrowers. She paused. "That's worth knowing." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the pages. "So what do we do with this?" "Right now, we register that payment today and we go home. I need time to think about how to use this without triggering him before we're ready." "And when we're ready," she closed the ledger. "When we're ready, we make sure there are witnesses." The drive back to Red Hollow was quieter than the drive out. Gideon drove and Alara looked at the land through the passenger window, the scrubby dry country rolling past, fence lines and rock outcroppings, and the occasional pale glint of a windmill. She was organizing her thinking, running through what she had, what she still needed, where the gaps were. "Can I ask you something?" Gideon said about halfway back. Not a question exactly, more like a notice that one was coming. "Go ahead. What happened to you before Red Hollow?" He kept his eyes on the road. "You don't have to answer. I've been watching you work and I don't understand why someone with your capabilities ended up in a position where you needed my notice." She didn't answer right away. The thing about that question was that there were 2 versions of the answer, the simple one and the real one. And she generally gave the simple one and left it at that. But he'd been straight with her about Clara, and about the ranch's situation, and about his own failures of management, and there was something owed in kind. "My father had a farm," she said, "about 200 miles east. Good land, decent operation. When he died, it passed to me legally. I was his only heir. My mother had died the year before. My father's business partner disputed it, said they'd had a verbal agreement about the farm going to him in the event of my father's death." She paused. "He had more money than I did, and more friends in town. The legal fight took everything I had in 2 years of my life, and I still lost." Gideon didn't say anything. "I came to Red Hollow because I'd heard there was work here, and I didn't know anyone, which felt like a good thing at the time. Turns out not knowing anyone has different outcomes depending on whether the town decides to know you." She looked at the road ahead. "They decided not to." "Who told you you were bad luck?" "May Tilson, originally. First week I was here, I was involved in a minor accident on the street. A horse spooked and knocked over a cart. Nothing serious, but the cart belonged to a man who was well liked, and I was the stranger standing nearest to it. That was enough." She almost smiled, though it was a dry thing. "Once that story got out, everything that went wrong near me became my fault. The Fletcher boy broke his arm the same month I started working at the dry goods store. I got dismissed the following week." It's how it works," she said, not bitterly, just flatly. "It's not unique to Red Hollow. There's always someone a town decides is the problem, so they don't have to look for the real one. Gideon drove. The road curved north and the land opened up, wider and flatter, and on the horizon she could see the ridge that marked the edge of his property. "Well," he said finally, "for what it's worth, and I understand if it isn't worth much coming from here, I don't believe that." "I know you don't. That's why I answered the notice." He looked at her briefly, then back at the road. Neither of them said anything else for the remaining miles, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd sat in for a long time. She sent the payment by registered mail from the Red Hollow post office the same afternoon, using her own handwriting on the cover letter she'd drafted. Formal, precise, referencing the specific clause number and payment period the funds were intended to cover. She kept a carbon copy and stapled it to the postal receipt. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began to breathe differently. That was the only way she could describe it. Not transformed. The land was still dry, the herd still rebuilding, the finances still tight, in the way of something that had been bent hard and was slowly straightening. But the particular feeling of a ship taking on water and nobody at the pump, that had changed. There was a direction now, a logic to the days that went beyond just surviving them. She got the North Pasture's water situation properly addressed by finding an unused cistern behind the old equipment shed. It had been covered with boards, and she'd nearly missed it. That was still structurally sound. With an afternoon's work, she had it connected to the collection basin they'd built earlier, and suddenly the North Pasture had a reliable secondary water supply for the first time in 2 seasons. Gideon looked at it for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. The look of a man who'd been running on empty for so long that improvement felt almost suspicious. "This was here the whole time," he said. "You were too busy to look." "I should have looked." "You had 30 other things failing," she said. "Stop being hard on yourself about the ones that were just hidden." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't do that, do you? You don't beat yourself up about what you missed." "I do," she said. "I just do it at night when no one's watching. Doesn't help the cistern get fixed any faster." He made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time, short and a little surprised at itself. She found she liked the sound of it. The grazing rotation was showing real results by the end of the 6th week. The 2 rested pasture sections had visible grass regrowth, thin, still patchy, but green. The cattle in those sections were putting on weight. Alara had restructured the feeding schedule to make the most of their hay stores and bought a small supplement supply from a feed merchant in the next county who sold at better rates than the Red Hollow dealer. She'd found him through a notice in an agricultural paper she'd been reading since before she left her father's farm, and the satisfaction of a practical solution applied in a practical situation was one she allowed herself without apology. Gideon handled the cattle, and she handled the books, and gradually, tentatively, those lines started to blur. He began asking her opinion on herd management decisions. She began asking his on the land itself, because whatever his financial blind spots had been, his understanding of the soil and the weather patterns and the behavior of this particular stretch of land was deep and earned. They'd work through the morning separately and come together over the kitchen table at midday, and the conversations that started as operational briefings sometimes went longer. "You ever think about what you do with the ranch if the rail line comes through?" she asked one afternoon, not because she had an agenda, but because it had been sitting at the edge of her thinking. "Some." "What do you think?" He poured himself more coffee. "Depends on what kind of access it gives. If there's a depot reasonably close, cattle transport costs drop significantly. That changes what it makes sense to run, how many head, what breed." He looked at his cup. "Claire and I used to talk about expanding the herd if we could get better transport access. Going to 150 head eventually, maybe more. That's a real operation." It was a real plan. He said it with the particular weight of something that belonged to a life that had been interrupted. She thought about the land registry pages in her ledger, about Northern Reach Holdings and 7 acquired properties and Silas Crow's quiet, systematic theft of other people's futures. "It could still be," she said. He looked at her, not with the wariness she might have expected. She'd been careful not to push on the tender places, but with something more open than that, considering. "One problem at a time," he said. "Yes, but the problems are connected. That's what I'm trying to show you." "I know." He turned the cup. "I know that, Quinn." The registered payment arrived at Crow Lending's office and was acknowledged. She knew because she'd asked the post office to confirm delivery, and they had. She expected silence from Crow's direction for a while, the acknowledgement of a setback in his timeline. What she got instead was a visit. He came on a Tuesday, mid-morning, in a good coat and a new hat, and with an assistant she'd never seen before, who carried a leather satchel and stood slightly behind his employer the way men did when they were being used as scenery. Silas Crow was older than she'd imagined. Late 50s, silver-haired, with the broad, settled look of a man who'd gotten comfortable with having things go his way. He wasn't crude or loud. That was the thing she registered first. The dangerous men she'd dealt with in her life had been the quiet, well-dressed kind. The ones who smiled at you while explaining your options. She was in the yard when his buggy came up the road. She'd been checking the fence posts on the east side and had a hammer in her hand when she turned and saw it. She watched it come without moving. Gideon came out of the barn. "Mr. Rourke," Crow said, stepping down from the buggy with the ease of a man who owned the ground he was standing on, or intended to. "I believe we're due for a conversation." "You could have written," Gideon said. "I prefer directness." Crow glanced at Alara with a look that assessed and dismissed in the same motion. "Is this a good time?" "Same as any." Crow turned toward the house with the assumption that he'd be invited in, and Gideon, after a moment's hesitation, gestured for him to come ahead. Alara set down her hammer and followed. They sat in the kitchen, and Alara found a chair at the end of the table. Not the head, not hovering, just present. And she watched Crow arrange his papers, and his assistant stood by the door. The assistant looked about 25 and uncomfortable. "I received your payment," Crow said. "I'll acknowledge that." "Registered mail," Alara said. "As of the 8th. Crow looked at her directly for the first time. "And you are?" "Alara Quinn, ranch manager." There was a pause. Something shifted in his expression. A small recalculation. "I see. Mr. Rourke, I came to discuss restructuring terms for the outstanding balance." "I made a payment," Gideon said. "The balance is 2 payments, not 3. It's 2 payments plus late fees, which are specified in the agreement." Crow opened his folder. "What I'm proposing is a refinancing arrangement that would consolidate the arrears into the principal and extend the loan term, which would lower the monthly payment," Alara said, "while adding interest over an extended term, which would result in significantly more total paid than the original note, and which would require a new agreement superseding the current one." Crow looked at her again. This time, the look was different. Not dismissal. Something more careful. "The terms would be competitive." "What's the new rate?" she asked. He named it. She wrote it down and did the math in her head. "That's a higher effective rate than the original note when you account for the extension," she said. "By about 12% over the full term." Gideon was looking at her. She kept her attention on Crow. "There are other considerations," Crow said. "The current note has provisions that, given the history of late payments, could be interpreted as—" "Could be interpreted," she said, "but whether they would be is a question for a county judge, which is where it would go if foreclosure proceedings were filed. And at that point, the terms would be examined in detail by a magistrate, along with the history of this lending arrangement and others conducted by your office in this corridor." She held his gaze without blinking. "Is that the direction you'd prefer this to go?" There was a silence that lasted long enough to be significant. Crow leaned back slightly. The folder stayed open in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it anymore. He was looking at her with the focused attention of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had fully read. "You're well informed for a ranch hand," he said. "Ranch manager," she said. "And yes." Gideon had both hands on the table. She could see the tension in them, could feel him wanting to say something and holding back. He was trusting her to run this, and she was aware of that trust the way you're aware of weight. "Mr. Crow," she said, "Mr. Rourke will continue making payments under the original note terms. If there's a genuine dispute about the current outstanding balance, including the late fee calculations, we'd welcome the opportunity to review that in writing. But the restructuring proposal as described doesn't serve this ranch's interests, and I'd encourage you not to read the payment as an opening for renegotiation." Crow closed his folder. He did it slowly, the way men like him did things when they were angry but too composed to let it show. He stood, nodded to his assistant, and picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. "I'll be in touch," he said to Gideon. "I'm sure you will," Gideon said. Crow looked at Alara one more time before he left. It was a measuring look, the kind that said, "I know what you're doing, and also this isn't over." She met it straight on. She listened to his buggy leave the yard before she exhaled. Gideon sat for a moment in the quiet. Then, "You just told Silas Crow no in his own face. In your face, this is your kitchen." "Quinn?" He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. "That man is not going to let this go." "No," she agreed. "He's not." "So what do we do?" She looked at the pages in her ledger, the land records, the acquisition dates, the name Northern Reach Holdings. "We make sure that when he pushes back, we're ready with more than he expects." She looked at Gideon. "And we need someone else to know what we know. A witness who isn't on this ranch." "Who do you trust?" She thought for a moment. "Who do you trust?" He leaned forward, both forearms on the table. "There's a man named Hal Gentry. He runs the land office in Millhaven, been there 15 years. He's not going to be pushed by Crow or bought by him. He's also one of the few people who'd know what to do with documentation like this if it needed to go somewhere official. Can you get me an introduction? I can take you there myself." She looked at the empty doorway where Crow had been standing 20 minutes ago. The feeling in the room had changed. Not fear, nothing close to fear, but a clarity about what they were actually dealing with. Not a difficult lender, a scheme, a deliberate, patient, well-funded scheme running on the drought's cover, and the isolation of struggling ranchers who didn't know to look at the larger pattern. She knew the pattern now. She'd seen it before, in the legal fight over her father's farm, in the way power arranged itself when it expected no resistance. The only real answer to that kind of arranged power was documentation and witnesses, and refusing to be isolated. "We leave for Millhaven Thursday," she said. Gideon nodded. Outside, the afternoon had turned cool and the light was going flat and gray, the way it did before weather came in. She could hear the cattle in the far pasture, the sound of them settling, the ordinary sound of a working ranch in the late afternoon. She picked up her pencil and went back to work. Hal Gentry turned out to be a short, precise man in his early 50s who wore the same expression whether he was discussing the weather or a potential land fraud case, which was to say, careful and slightly skeptical, the face of someone who'd seen enough people walk through his door with stories that turned out to be simpler than advertised. He had a cluttered office on the ground floor of the Millhaven Land Administration building, stacks of bound ledgers on every flat surface, and a window that looked out at a brick wall. And he listened to Alara's presentation without interrupting, which she respected. She'd organized everything the night before. The land registry copies she'd made on her first courthouse visit, arranged in chronological order. Her notes on the Northern Reach Holdings registration, the acquisition timeline, the relationship between the drought classification date and the company formation date. The payment structure discrepancies she'd found between Gideon's mortgage terms and what she'd been able to piece together about the Mercer property terms from public filings. She walked him through it in 20 minutes, flat and factual, and when she finished, she put the folder on the desk in front of him and let him look. Gentry picked up the pages one at a time. He didn't rush. Gideon sat in the other chair and watched the land officer's face with the focused attention of someone who understood that the next few minutes mattered. "Northern Reach Holdings," Gentry said, not to either of them in particular. "I've seen this name on 2 filings in the past year. I didn't connect it to Crow." "The registration doesn't list him by name," Alara said. "It lists a man named Dowell Fitch as the registrant. I believe Fitch works for Crow as a loan officer." Gentry looked up at her. "How do you know that?" "I went back to the county seat registry the day before yesterday. Fitch's name appears on 3 Crow lending documents from 2 years ago as a signatory. He's an employee." Gideon looked at her. She hadn't told him about the second courthouse visit. She'd done it on her own. On a morning she'd told him she was going to check on supplies in the next town, which was also true. She'd done both. Gentry set the pages down. "Miss Quinn, what you've assembled here is a pattern. It's a compelling one. But it's not yet evidence of illegal activity. Forming a subsidiary company isn't a crime. Acquiring properties through foreclosure isn't a crime. Even setting different loan terms for different borrowers, while potentially unethical, isn't necessarily—" "I know," she said. "I'm not claiming a crime yet. I'm showing you a scheme. The question is whether there's a legal line being crossed somewhere in the process." She pulled one specific page from the folder. "This is the Mercer acquisition. The foreclosure was filed 11 days after the second missed payment. But the standard note terms in this county require 3 missed payments before filing is permitted under territorial lending statutes. Gentry looked at the page. He was quiet for a moment. The Mercer note had non-standard terms. Yes, but the question is whether those terms were disclosed properly under territory lending law, and whether Crow had the right to impose them unilaterally without the borrower's explicit acknowledgement of the deviation. She paused. I'm not a lawyer, but I know someone should look at it. The land officer was still looking at the page. Something had changed in his expression. The mild skepticism had been replaced by something more focused. Do you have a copy of the Mercer note itself? I can't get the original. It's a private contract, but the filing at foreclosure references the key terms, and those are public record. She turned to the next page. It's there. Gentry read it. He read it again. Then he set the folder down carefully, the way people set things down when they're treating them as important, and looked at Alara with an assessment that was different from the one he'd given her when she walked in. Leave these copies with me, he said. I'm not making any promises, but I want to look at the Mercer filing more carefully, and I want to pull 2 other foreclosure records from the past 2 years that may be relevant. How long will that take? A week. Maybe 10 days. She did the math. That's workable. Crow hasn't filed formal notice on Gideon's property yet. We still have time on the timeline. You're sure about that? I've checked the filing registry twice. Nothing. Gentry looked at Gideon for the first time in several minutes. You've got a sharp person working for you, Mr. Rourke. Gideon looked at her. Yes, he said. I know. And the ride back to Red Hollow that afternoon had a different quality to it than the drive to Millhaven. Something had shifted. The weight of what they were doing was still there, but it sat differently now that someone outside the ranch knew about it. Alara watched the road and felt the cautious, particular relief of a person who'd been carrying a plan alone and had finally found somewhere to set part of it down. You went back to the courthouse without telling me, Gideon said. He didn't say it with accusation, more like he was naming something he was still deciding how to feel about. I didn't want to raise expectations before I confirmed what I was looking for. If I'd gone and found nothing, there was no point in you knowing I'd gone. What if something had happened to you? She turned to look at him. He was watching the road, his expression neutral, but the question itself wasn't neutral. Nothing was going to happen to me at a public courthouse. That's not the point. She considered that. You're right, I should have said where I was going. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not your keeper, Quinn. You understand that. But we're working on this together, and I'd rather know. Understood. She looked back at the road. I'll tell you when I'm doing something that touches the Crow situation. Everything touches the Crow situation right now. Fair point. They drove. The land outside the window was the same pale and dry landscape it always was. The same scrub and rock and faded sky. But something about it looked different to her this afternoon. Less like a place she'd ended up, and more like a place she'd chosen. The distinction was small and probably not worth examining too closely, but she noticed it. What does Gentry do with what we gave him? Gideon asked. He looks for confirmation. If the Mercer foreclosure terms really were filed in violation of lending statute, he can refer it to the Territory Administration. That triggers a review process that Crow can't simply make go away. How long does a review process take? Long enough to stop any new foreclosure filings while it's active. Gideon absorbed that. And if Gentry doesn't find a violation, then we know where we stand and we plan accordingly. She turned back to him. But I think he'll find it. The Mercer timeline is wrong, and I don't think Crow was careless about it. I think he was confident that nobody was looking carefully enough to notice. He miscalculated. He miscalculated the moment he posted that hiring notice, and you answered it and hired me. She said it simply, not bragging, just the sequence of events as she saw them. Gideon glanced at her. The late sun was coming at a low angle through the windshield, and it caught the side of his face, the tiredness there, and something else. Something that had been slowly replacing the tiredness over the past weeks. Less like optimism, which would have felt wrong on him, and more like resolution. Like a man who'd found his footing again after a long time off balance. Quinn, he said. Yes. Thank you. She didn't answer right away. The words sat in the cab of the truck with more weight than he'd probably intended. She was aware of what it cost him to say it. Not because he was ungrateful, but because Gideon Rourke was not a man who said things he didn't mean, which meant the simple ones landed harder. "Let's save your ranch first," she said. "Then we'll figure out what we owe each other." Crow's next move came faster than she'd expected. It was a letter, not a visit this time. Formal, legal in its language, addressed to Gideon at the ranch. She read it at the kitchen table while Gideon stood at the window, and she kept her face neutral with some effort. The letter claimed that the payment she'd sent had been received, but was insufficient to interrupt the consecutive default timeline under an interpretation of the note's cure provision that she'd never encountered before. Crow's position, laid out in careful legal language by what was clearly a hired attorney, was that a partial cure of the arrearage, paying one of 3 outstanding payments, did not reset the consecutive default clock. Only a full cure of all outstanding amounts would satisfy the condition. It was wrong. She was almost certain it was wrong, but it was wrong in a way that required a specific legal argument to disprove. And if it went to a judge without being challenged, there was a possibility it would be accepted. "He's trying to intimidate you into signing the refinancing agreement," she said. "Is it working?" Gideon said from the window. He meant it as a joke, but there was an edge under it. "It's a legal argument that I believe is incorrect, but I'm not a lawyer and I need someone who is to tell us that clearly." She set the letter down. "Do you know any attorneys in Millhaven?" "There's a man named Phelps. He did my property work 6 years ago when I bought the land. I haven't had reason to use him since." "Can you reach him?" "I can send a wire today." "Do it. Send him the text of this letter and ask him specifically about the cure provision interpretation." She looked at the letter again. "One other thing." "What?" "This was sent 3 days after our visit to Gentry." Gideon turned from the window. "You think Crow knows we went to see him? I think Millhaven is a small town, and Crow has people there, and we weren't exactly hiding what we were doing." She kept her voice even. "It means we need to move faster than I planned. If he's already escalating, he may try to file formal notice before Gentry completes his review." "How do we stop that?" She looked at the letter one more time and then set it face down on the table, a decision she didn't fully understand herself until after she'd made it. "I'm going to write to the Territory Lending Administration directly, today, citing the Mercer filing irregularity and requesting that any foreclosure proceedings against this property be held pending review of related cases." "Can you do that? As a private citizen? Anyone can write a letter. What matters is whether it lands on the right desk at the right time, and whether I reference the right statutes when I write it." She stood up. "I need your legal documents on the property. Everything Phelps prepared 6 years ago, and the original deed." He went to get them without another word. She worked through most of that night. The letter to the Territory Administration took 4 drafts before it was right. Not because she was unsure of the content, but because the language had to be precise without being so technical that it was easy to dismiss. She cited the lending statutes she'd found in a territory law compendium at the Millhaven Courthouse Library on her second visit. She referenced the Mercer case by filing number and date. She noted the pattern of Northern Reach Holdings acquisitions without making an accusation she couldn't yet prove, framing it instead as context requiring examination. She sent it by registered mail the following morning, and then she waited, which was the hardest part of any plan. The ranch didn't wait with her. There was always work. The rotation check, the water management, the twice-daily observation of the herd that she'd made into a discipline. A ewe had gotten through a fence gap into the east pasture, which took half an afternoon to locate and repair. Gideon got a response from Phelps, the attorney, 3 days after sending the wire, and Alora read the reply at the kitchen table with Gideon standing over her shoulder. Phelps said the cure provision interpretation in Crow's letter was, in his opinion, legally incorrect. The standard reading of that clause under territory lending law did allow a single payment to interrupt the consecutive default timeline. He also said, with more caution, that if Crow pushed the argument in court, it would likely be settled in Gideon's favor, but that the process would take time and money. "Time and money," Gideon said. "He's not wrong about either, but we're not in court yet, and I'd like to keep it that way." She set the letter down. The thing about Crow's legal argument is that it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong in the end. What it does right now is make you feel like you're losing ground even when you're not. That's the purpose. It's working. Let it. She looked up at him. Let yourself feel uncertain. What you can't do is act like you're losing, because if you go to him now and ask about the refinancing agreement, he wins whether or not the argument ever goes to court. Gideon sat down across from her. I'm not going to do that. I know. I'm saying it anyway. He looked at the Phelps letter. What do we do in the meantime? We make the next payment, on schedule, same method. She pulled her ledger open, and we prepare for him to come here again. You think he will? He came once when he felt confident. He'll come again when he feels pressured. And when he does, I want there to be people present. She tapped her pencil on the page. Who in Red Hollow is not in Crow's pocket and not in the habit of repeating things selectively? Gideon thought for a moment. Berta Holt. She runs the post office. She's been here longer than anyone, and she doesn't like Crow. He tried to use the post office as a satellite for his loan collection notices, and she told him to use a proper agent like everyone else. Would she come out here if I asked her? Under what pretense? I'll think of one. She looked out the window at the yard where the afternoon was going long and gray, clouds building in the west the way they did when the weather was finally considering something. I need one more person, someone with legal standing if possible. Phelps is in Millhaven. That's too far to come on short notice. Is there a justice of the peace in Red Hollow? Older man named Culver. He doesn't do much these days, but he's still active. He and my father knew each other, back before. He paused. Before everything. Would he come if you asked him personally? Not me. You. Probably. He's always been decent toward me. She wrote both names in her ledger. Berta Holt, Culver J.P., witnesses. People who would see and remember and whose presence would mean Crow couldn't rewrite whatever happened next. Quinn, Gideon said. She looked up. What exactly are you planning? She set down the pencil. I'm planning for the moment when Crow runs out of legal maneuvering and decides to come here in person and apply pressure directly. I want that moment to happen in front of people. I want him to make his move publicly, where there are witnesses to whatever he says and however he says it. She met his eyes. And I want to have enough documented evidence in my hands at that moment that if he tries to push, I can push back harder than he expects. Gideon was looking at her steadily. That's a lot of things to line up. Yes. What if he doesn't come here? What if he just files the formal notice and skips the personal visit? Then we fight it at the county court with Phelps and everything we've assembled, and we have a reasonable chance of winning on the merits. She picked up the pencil again. But I don't think that's what he'll do. Men like Crow, they want you to feel small. They want to watch it happen. He'll come here. She was right, as it turned out. He came on the last Thursday of the month. She'd had 6 days to prepare, and she'd used all of them. Berta Holt arrived at the ranch at 9 in the morning under the pretense of delivering a package that Alara had arranged to have sent from the Millhaven Agricultural Supply, a legitimate order of fence staples that she'd timed specifically for this week. Berta was a compact woman with white hair and the direct gaze of someone who'd sorted other people's correspondence for 30 years and had very few illusions left. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee and made no comment about the unusual nature of a post office superintendent delivering a package personally, because Alara had told her the truth. She told Berta everything, not because she'd fully planned to, but because when she'd gone to the post office to arrange the delivery timing, Berta had looked at her in a certain way and said, Crow's been in here twice this month asking about registered mail sent from this address, and Alara had made a decision in about 4 seconds. Berta had listened to the summary without interruption. At the end she'd said, I always thought there was something off about how he operates. What do you need from me? And Alara had told her. Judge Culver arrived at 9:30, driven out by Gideon himself the previous evening and staying the night in the spare room that Alara had vacated to a bedroll in the barn, without comment. He was 72, walked with a cane, and had the particular alertness of a man who'd spent decades reading rooms and hadn't lost the skill. He drank his coffee and said very little, which she respected. Gentry from the Millhaven Land Office had sent a letter 2 days prior. He'd found the Mercer filing violation. He'd referred it to the Territory Administration. The referral was on record as of the previous Friday. She had that letter in her folder, along with everything else. Crow arrived at 11. He brought his assistant again, and this time a second man she didn't recognize, but broad-shouldered, positioned slightly ahead of the assistant, the kind of presence that was meant to make a room feel smaller. He looked at Judge Culver and Berta Holt, and then at Alara with an expression that was the first genuinely unguarded one she'd seen on him. Brief surprise, quickly suppressed. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I see you have company. People I trust," Gideon said. "Sit down." Crow sat. His two men stood. "I'll be brief," Crow said. "I'm here to formalize the position my attorney outlined in last week's correspondence. The outstanding arrearage constitutes grounds for accelerated proceedings under the terms of the note, and I'm prepared to offer Mr. Rourke one final opportunity to sign the refinancing agreement before I file formal notice with the county recorder." He placed a document on the table. Alara looked at it without touching it. "Before we discuss that document," she said, "I'd like to put some information in front of you, Mr. Crow, for transparency." He looked at her with the controlled patience of a man who expected a minor inconvenience. "Go ahead." She opened her folder. She went through it in order. The Northern Reach Holdings registration and its connection to Dowell Fitch, the 7 acquisition records, the timeline against the rail survey corridor, the Mercer foreclosure filing and its deviation from statutory lending requirements, the referral letter from Hal Gentry to the Territory Administration, dated and stamped. She put each document on the table as she named it, face up, clearly visible to everyone in the room. The room was quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of people being polite, but the quiet of people watching something they understood was important. "What Mr. Gentry found," she said, keeping her voice level, "is that the Mercer foreclosure was filed in violation of Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Territory Lending and Mortgage Act, which requires 3 full payment periods to lapse before acceleration is permissible under non-standard note terms, unless those terms have been separately and explicitly disclosed in a manner compliant with Section 11. She paused. The Mercer note terms were not disclosed in compliant form. The referral is active. That means any new foreclosure filings involving Crow lending properties in this county will be reviewed as part of the same administrative process. She looked at him. That review, she said, will include this property and this note and the full acquisition history of Northern Reach Holdings. Silas Crow had not moved. She'd watched his face through the entire presentation, and she'd seen the moment, about 2/3 of the way through, when his expression had stopped being controlled and had simply gone still. Not angry, not afraid exactly, still. The stillness of a man who had just understood the dimensions of something he hadn't previously measured. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Judge Culver. He looked at Berta Holt, who was watching him with the calm, unhurried attention of a woman who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. Then he looked at Alara. "You've been busy," he said quietly. "I've been thorough," she said. "There's a difference." "Young woman, Miss Quinn," Gideon said from his end of the table. His voice was quiet, but it landed. "Her name is Alara Quinn." Another silence. The broad-shouldered man near the door shifted his weight, and Berta Holt turned and looked at him with the specific kind of look that retired his usefulness as intimidation on the spot. Crow stood. He picked up the refinancing document from the table, folded it, and put it in his coat. He gathered his hat. He looked at Alara one last time, and she held his gaze without any particular expression, just looked back at him the way she looked at everything she was assessing, steady and without flinching. "We'll see how the territory review proceeds," he said. "Yes," she said, "we will." He left. The sound of his buggy on the yard gravel faded, and then the kitchen was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of the day outside. Wind, cattle, somewhere in the east pasture, a crow calling from the fence line. Judge Culver set down his coffee cup. He looked at the document still spread across the table, and then at Alara with an expression that had several things in it she didn't immediately know how to name. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I've been in and around the law in this county for a long time." He paused. "That was one of the more effective pieces of work I've seen at a kitchen table." Berta Holt made a sound that was definitely a laugh. She covered it with her coffee cup. Alara looked at the table, at the documents she'd spent 6 weeks assembling from courthouse records and late nights, and a ledger her mother had never known would end up being used for this. She felt something, but it wasn't triumph. It was more like the particular exhaustion that followed real effort. The kind you didn't let yourself feel until it was done. Gideon was looking at her from across the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The expression on his face said what words would have made awkward. Something about seeing her fully, finally, without any of the distance that practical arrangements required. She looked back at him for a moment. Then she started putting the documents back in order. There was still work to do. Crow leaving didn't mean the fight was over. Alara knew that before his buggy had cleared the end of the drive. The territory review was active, which meant Crow couldn't file new foreclosure proceedings without those proceedings being examined in the context of the Mercer case and the pattern she'd documented. That was real protection, but it wasn't permanent protection, and the distinction mattered. A review could be concluded in Crow's favor if the Territory Administration decided the Mercer violation was isolated rather than systemic. A review could be slow-walked if Crow had relationships at that level, and she had no way of knowing yet whether he did. What she knew was that the review bought time, and time was what they needed to convert into something more durable. That something was money. The ranch needed to make the remaining outstanding payments, 2 now, plus the one coming due at month's end, in order to bring the mortgage fully current. Once current, Crow lost his procedural ground entirely. He could still pursue the land through other means, but he'd lose the foreclosure lever, and without it, his scheme was considerably slower and more expensive to operate. Getting current was the goal. Everything else was management. She laid it out for Gideon that evening after Berta and Judge Culver had gone. They sat at the kitchen table with the financial ledger open between them, and she walked through the numbers the way she'd done a dozen times before, but this time with specific targets attached to specific dates. The herd is at 41 head, she said. The 8 we sold in Mill Haven brought us enough to cover 1 payment. We need to cover 2 more plus the current one coming due. That's 3 payments total. I can't sell enough cattle to cover 3 payments without gutting the breeding stock, Gideon said. You're not going to. She turned the page. I've been looking at this from the wrong angle. We've been thinking about what to sell. We should be thinking about what to lease. He looked at her. The land. The north pasture. The section past the second water source. You're not running cattle on it right now. The graze is too depleted to carry any more head than you've already got. But the soil there is different, deeper. Even in drought conditions, it holds moisture better than the southern sections. She pulled a separate sheet of notes from the back of the ledger. I've been watching it for 6 weeks. There's a man named Dawes who runs a sheep operation 8 miles east of here. He mentioned at Pryor's sale, I heard him talking to another man, that he's short on pasture this season. His eastern parcels burned in a grass fire in March. I know Dawes. We're not close, but we're civil. If you lease him the north section for the season, even at modest rates, the income covers 1 full payment and half of another. She set the pencil down. Combined with what we can get from the 3 steers you told me were ready for market last week, we're short only a fraction of the 3rd payment. Gideon studied the numbers. She watched him work through it, the way he did mathematics in his head with a slight stillness, eyes not quite focused on the page, adding things she couldn't see. The fraction, he said. How much? She told him. It was not a small number, but it was a manageable one given one other factor she'd been saving. The cistern repair and the basin collection system reduced your water hauling costs enough that you've been underspending your operating budget by about $40 a month for the past 6 weeks, she said. I've been tracking it separately. That's sitting in your account, and you haven't spent it because you didn't know to account for it. He looked at her for a long moment. You tracked savings I didn't know I had. I track everything. He was quiet. She could see him adding it up. The lease income, the steer sale, the accumulated operational savings, and arriving at the same number she had. Not comfortable, not easy, but achievable, inside a timeline that worked. When do I need to talk to Dawes? He said. This week, before anyone else approaches him about that pasture. He nodded slowly. I'll ride out tomorrow morning. Take me with you. He looked up. Why? Because I've seen how lease negotiations go when only one party has thought about the terms in advance. She held his gaze. Let me be useful, Gideon. He didn't argue. What? They rode out to Dawes's operation the following morning. Horses, not the truck, because the track east was rough, and Gideon said horses were faster on that particular ground. He was right. Alara had ridden competently since childhood, but not regularly in recent years. and she felt the first hour in the saddle in her legs and lower back with the particular honesty that physical work always delivered. She didn't mention it. Dawes was a lean, weathered man who'd built his sheep operation through 2 decades of systematic work and had the slightly suspicious hospitality of someone who didn't get many visitors and wasn't sure what to make of them when they arrived. He gave them coffee in his kitchen, which was sparer than Gideon's, and listened to the proposal with his eyes on the table more than on either of them. "North section of Iron Ridge," he said, past the second water point. "Correct," Alara said. "Approximately 40 acres. The grass is thin, but it's recovering. You can see the regrowth already. Your sheep will do better on depleted grass than cattle would, and the water access is stable." Dawes looked at Gideon. "She your ranch manager?" "She is," Gideon said. Dawes looked back at Alara. There was nothing hostile in it, just assessment. She'd been assessed by enough men in enough rooms to simply let it happen and wait. "What terms are you looking at?" he said. She named a monthly rate and a season length. Dawes made a sound that wasn't quite disagreement, more like a reflexive negotiating response. She'd anticipated it and had a counterposition already structured. They went 3 rounds, which was more than she'd expected and less than it could have been, and arrived at a number that was lower than her opening position and higher than what she'd privately told herself was acceptable. When they rode back, Gideon was quiet for the first mile. "You gave up $4 a month without blinking," he said eventually. "I gave up $4 to close the deal today, instead of having him think about it for a week and potentially talk to someone else." She glanced at him. The $4 was worth it. How do you know what's worth it and what isn't? You learn to feel the room. When Dawes stopped looking at the table and started looking at me, he was ready to close. I just needed to give him something that felt like a win without actually being one. Gideon was quiet for another stretch of road. Then, "Where did you learn this? Not the ranch work, all of it." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Losing," she said. "I learned most of it from the things I lost. The farm, the legal case, 3 years of doors closing in Red Hollow." She kept her eyes on the track ahead. "You learn to read situations carefully when you can't afford to misread them." He didn't say anything for a while. The horses moved through the dry country at a steady walk, the morning warming up around them, and somewhere to the south she could hear cattle, not theirs, a neighbor's herd. And the land had its own rhythm that she'd gotten used to without noticing when it had happened. "I lost things too," Gideon said. Not as comparison, not as competition, just as a thing that was true. "I know. And I still misread situations." "So do I," she said. "Less often than I used to." He looked at her then, and there was something in it she'd been careful not to name directly, had been careful about since the night in the barn with the difficult berth and the lamplight. She looked back at him for one honest moment, then looked at the road. "Let's get the lease agreement written up before Dawes changes his mind," she said. "He won't change his mind." "No, but it's better to have it on paper." But the territory review moved faster than she'd expected. A letter arrived from the administration office 12 days after she'd sent her initial inquiry. It was formal and carefully worded in the way of official correspondence, but its substance was clear. The Mercer case referral had been accepted for full review, and pending that review, any new foreclosure proceedings filed by Crow Lending against properties in the Northern Corridor would require administrative pre-clearance before advancing to the county recorder's office. The review timeline was estimated at 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90 days was a wall between Crow and the ranch. Not a permanent one, but a wall. She read the letter twice standing at the kitchen table, then set it down and went outside. Gideon was in the equipment shed doing maintenance on the tractor's cutting attachment, which had been on his list since February. She'd been after him about it for 2 weeks. She stood in the shed doorway. "It came," she said. He looked up from what he was doing, read her face before she said another word. "The review. Pre-clearance required for any new proceedings, 60 to 90 days. He set down the wrench. He didn't say anything immediately. She watched something pass through him. Relief, she thought, but not the clean kind. The complicated kind that came when something bad had been avoided, and you were only now allowing yourself to feel how bad it could have been. "That's enough time," he said. "If the Dawes lease income comes in on schedule, and if the steer sale goes through, yes." She leaned against the door frame. We'll be current on the mortgage before the review concludes. Once we're current, even if the review finds nothing actionable against Crow, he's lost his leverage on this property. And the other properties, the ones he's already taken, she'd been thinking about that. That's not in our hands. Gentry knows what he has. The administration knows what they're looking at. What happens with the Mercer family or the others? I can't control that, and neither can you. What we can control is this ranch. It doesn't feel right, he said, that those families lost what they lost and there might not be any. I know. She said it quietly. I know it doesn't, but putting Crow under a territory review is more than anyone else managed to do. And if the review finds what I think it will find in the Mercer case, the territory has a basis for a broader investigation. We've done what we can do. She paused. For now. He picked up the wrench again, turned it in his hands. You're better at separating what you can control from what you can't than I am. I've had more practice. She pushed off the doorframe. The steer sale. Can you arrange it for Thursday? I'd rather get that money in hand before the end of the month payment comes due. I'll call Pryor's this afternoon. She was already walking back toward the house when he said her name. She stopped, turned. He was still in the shed, wrench in hand, looking at her with the particular directness that she'd come to understand meant he was about to say something he'd been sitting on for a while. When all this is done, when the mortgage is current and Crow is dealt with one way or another, what are you going to do? The question was simple. The answer was not. She'd been not looking at it for weeks, the way you didn't look directly at the sun. What she was going to do, what came next, whether Red Hollow was still only a place she'd been waiting to have enough money to leave, or whether it had become something else without her noticing. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded, slow. Okay. He looked down at the cutting attachment. That's a fair answer. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a moment longer than she needed to before sitting down to work. The Dawes lease payment came in on a Wednesday. The steer sale the following Thursday went well, better than well, actually, because there were two buyers at Pryor's competing for the same grade of animal, and Gideon, who knew how to hold his position in a sale pen in a way that Alara understood was its own skill, worked the situation without help from her and came back with a number 4% above the listed market rate. He was pleased in the restrained way he was pleased about things. A slight loosening around the eyes, a quiet in his movements that was different from the usual quiet. Good sale, she said when he told her. Better than good. She entered the number in the ledger, added it to the Dawes payment, added the accumulated operational savings, ran the total, looked at the mortgage payment schedule, ran it again. We're current, she said. He was at the stove making coffee. He stopped. Say that again. With what came in today, plus what we had, plus the savings I've been tracking, we can make all three outstanding payments and the current month's payment and be fully current on the mortgage as of this week. She turned the ledger toward him. Look. He came to the table, looked at the numbers. She watched him check her arithmetic, the way careful people always check things that mattered, and arrive at the same conclusion. He sat down, not dramatically, not with any particular display, just sat down in his chair at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the wood and looked at the ledger. 3 months ago, he said. 3 months ago what? 3 months ago I thought I was going to lose this ranch. I was making peace with it. He looked up at her. I'd been making peace with it for a long time and I didn't even know it. I'd stopped believing it was fixable. She didn't say anything. Then you showed up. He paused. I posted that notice because I needed help and I was out of options. I didn't post it thinking, I didn't expect... He stopped, started again. I didn't expect you. Gideon, I'm not saying it to make you uncomfortable. I just need to say it plainly because I don't know how to say things any other way. He kept his eyes on hers. This ranch is alive because of what you did. Not mostly because of it, entirely. That's not true. It's nearly true. You kept it running for 3 years alone. You maintained the herd, the equipment, the land. You kept making payments when you could, and when you couldn't, you fought to make the next one. I came in with skills you needed. That's not the same as you not having done the work. He was quiet, looking at her in the way that made the air in the room feel different, not uncomfortable, not pressured, just charged with something unspoken that had been accumulating slowly for 2 months. What you said earlier, he said, about not knowing what you're going to do. Yes. I've been thinking about that. She waited. I'm not good at... I want to say this right. He looked at his hands on the table. After Clara died, I told myself I was done with that, with wanting anything beyond what I could manage alone. It was easier than the alternative. He looked back up. Then you came here, and I found out I'd been wrong about what I could manage alone. She was very still. I'm not asking you to stay as an employee, he said. I'm asking... He stopped, tried again. I don't know exactly what I'm asking. I know what I want to ask, and I'm not sure I have the right to ask it yet. Then don't ask it yet, she said quietly. We just made the mortgage current. Let's get through the review. Let's see what Crow does next. She looked at him with something that was not distance, that was the opposite of distance, but that understood timing. Some things don't have to be said immediately to be real. He looked at her for a long moment. Something settled in him. She could see it, the particular settling of a man who'd been braced for an answer and received something more careful and more true. All right, he said. Outside, the late afternoon had gone soft and orange, the light coming in low through the kitchen window, the way it did in early autumn when the season was starting to turn. The ranch was quiet in the way of a place that had found its rhythm again. Cattle in the far pasture, the creak of the barn in the wind, the ordinary sounds that added up to something functioning. Alara looked at the ledger, fully current. The words sat in her chest with a weight she didn't try to name too precisely. She closed the book. In the morning, she would write to Phelps, the attorney, and inform him of their current status. She would send the payment by registered mail to Crow's office and keep the receipt. She would write a follow-up letter to Gentry at the land office and to the territory administration, noting that the mortgage was now fully current, which mattered for the record. There were still things that could go wrong. The review could take longer than estimated. Crow could find another angle. The land and the weather and the market did not rearrange themselves into generosity just because one battle had been won. But the ranch was not going to be taken this month. It was not going to be taken next month. And for the first time in longer than she'd been here to witness it, that was a fact rather than a hope. She picked up her pencil and started the letter to Phelps. It was nearly dark before she finished. The registered payment reached Crow's office on a Friday, and by the following Tuesday, word had spread through Red Hollow in the particular way that news spread in small towns. Not announced, not posted, but moving from mouth to mouth through the feed store and the post office and the tables at the diner on Caldwell Street, until it had reached everyone who mattered and several people who didn't. Alara heard about it from Berta Holt, who came by the ranch on a legitimate errand this time. A package from Millhaven, actual correspondence from Phelps, the attorney, and mentioned it with the careful casualness of someone delivering news they knew was significant. People are talking, Berta said. She was standing in the yard, not coming in, one hand on the package. About what happened here, about Crow leaving the way he did, and about the territory review. She paused. About you. What are they saying? Berta looked at her with the directness that had made her easy to trust from the beginning. Some of them are saying what they always say about things they don't understand, that you must have had some angle, some reason for getting involved that wasn't entirely honest. She paused. Those are the smaller number. The larger number are saying that a woman they wrote off 3 years ago just did what none of them thought to do, which is look at what Crow was actually doing and hold it up to the light. Alara took the package. And what do you say? Berta tilted her head slightly. I say that a town that ignores a capable person for 3 years out of habit and small-mindedness doesn't get to be surprised when that person turns out to be exactly what they needed. She picked up her bag. I also say Red Hollow has a long memory for the wrong things and a short one for the right things, and that's not going to change because of one situation, however it turned out. I know, Alara said. Good. Berta looked at her steadily. I hope you stay anyway. She drove back down the road before Alara could decide how to respond to that. The territory review concluded 38 days after it had opened, which was faster than the 60 to 90-day estimate and faster than Alara had planned for. The letter from the administration office was addressed to her directly. She'd been the one who'd filed the initial complaint, and it ran to 4 pages, which was unusual for official correspondence, and told her before she'd read a word that the finding was substantive. She sat at the kitchen table and read it through twice before she called Gideon in from the barn. The Mercer foreclosure had been found to be procedurally deficient under Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Territory Lending and Mortgage Act. The non-standard acceleration terms in the Mercer note had not been disclosed in a manner compliant with Section 11's transparency requirements. The foreclosure was being referred to the territory court for potential reversal. Additionally, the review had identified two other properties, the Halsey parcel and the Dunmore Ranch, both acquired by Northern Reach Holdings in the past 2 years, as potentially subject to the same procedural deficiency, and both were being flagged for separate review. Northern Reach Holdings was named formally in the document as a related entity to Crow Lending and Silas Crow personally. The connection Alara had drawn from public records had been confirmed through the administration's own investigation, which had access to corporate registration documents she hadn't been able to reach. There was a final paragraph that she read carefully and then sat down and looked at the window for a moment before reading again. Based on the findings of this review and the pattern of acquisition documented in the supporting materials, the Territory Administration is referring the matter of Crow Lending's foreclosure practices to the Territory Attorney General's Office for further investigation into potential violations of territorial commerce statutes. Attorney General's Office. That was beyond anything she'd planned for. That was the administration deciding that what she'd documented was not a single procedural error, but a pattern that warranted criminal examination. Gideon read the letter standing at the table. She watched his face go through several things in succession: the careful focus of reading, the recognition of specific passages, and then a stillness when he reached the final paragraph that lasted long enough to mean something. He set the letter down. "The Attorney General," he said. "Yes." "You didn't expect that." "I hoped for it. I didn't expect it this quickly." He looked at her. "What does it mean for Crow?" "It means he's under investigation for something considerably more serious than a procedural filing error. It means the properties he acquired through Northern Reach Holdings are under scrutiny. It means the rail land scheme, whatever he was building, is going to be examined by people with subpoena authority." She paused. "What it means for him personally, I can't say. That depends on what the Attorney General finds and how aggressively they pursue it. But his ability to operate in this county the way he has been operating is finished. His ability to foreclose on anyone in the northern corridor while this investigation is active is finished." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "And us?" "The mortgage on this ranch is current. The review found no irregularity in how your note was written. He was harder on the Mercers and the others than on you, probably because he moved more carefully with the ranches he wanted most and fastest. Your note is legitimate." She looked at the letter. "You're protected. The ranch is safe." He sat down slowly. Not dramatically. Gideon didn't do anything dramatically, but with the weight of a man who had been bracing for so long that the act of releasing that brace required physical adjustment. They sat with that for a while. The morning was cool and clear, one of the first properly cool mornings of the season, and the light coming through the kitchen window was the thin, bright kind that meant autumn had actually arrived. Outside, she could hear the cattle in the near pasture and the particular sound of the ranch settling into its day. "What about the Mercer family?" Gideon said. "The referral to court is for potential reversal of the foreclosure. If the court finds it was improper, they could be restored to the property." She chose her words carefully. "It's not certain. It depends on the court's interpretation and whether the Mercers can be located and make their case. But it's possible. That's more than it was 2 months ago." He looked at the table. "They relocated, I heard, Eastern Territories. If they get notification from the court, they can decide whether to pursue it." She paused. "I can't make that happen, but the door is open in a way it wasn't before." He was quiet. She understood the silence. It was the silence of a man who was glad his own ground was secure and guilty about that gladness in the face of what others had lost. It was an honest feeling. She didn't try to talk him out of it. "It's not nothing," she said. "What we did. It's not everything, but it's not nothing." "I know." He looked at her. "I know that." 3 days after the letter, May Tilson came to the ranch. Alara was in the yard checking the water levels in the cistern when the buggy came down the drive, and she recognized it before she recognized the driver, and she kept working until May pulled up and stepped down with the slightly overcomposed manner of a person who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was already uncertain about it. "Miss Quinn," May said. "Mrs. Tilson." Alara straightened up and looked at her without particular warmth or hostility. Just looked. May stood with her hands clasped in front of her. She was dressed as she always was. Neat, proper, the seamstress's instinct for presentation never quite going off duty. She looked at the yard, at the barn, at the water system, and then at Alara. I heard about the territory review, May said. Most people have. I wanted to... She stopped, started again. I know I was one of the first people in Red Hollow to say what I said about you when you first arrived, the cart incident. Yes, May looked at her hands. I don't know that I have an explanation that's worth anything. It was a small-minded thing to do, and I kept doing it because it was easier than admitting I'd started it for no good reason. She looked up. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't know that I've earned that, but I wanted to say it to your face, which is the least I could do. Alara regarded her for a moment. May Tilson was not a cruel woman. That was the complicated truth. She was an ordinary woman who had done an ordinary kind of harm, the kind that didn't require malice, only convenience and the company of other people willing to agree. That kind of harm was almost harder to be angry about in the end, because there was no satisfying villain in it, just people taking the easier path. I appreciate you coming out to say it, Alara said. That's not nothing. May looked at her with something that might have been relief, or might have been the recognition that an easier response than she deserved was still not absolution. Is there anything I can do? Alara thought about it, not the question, but what was actually behind it, the particular discomfort of people who had been wrong and needed a way to be useful. Tell people the truth about what happened here, she said. Not the version that makes me heroic and Crow a cartoon villain, the actual version, which is that a ranch was struggling and needed help, and the help happened to come from someone this town had decided wasn't worth looking at. She paused. That's all. May nodded. She looked like she wanted to say more and thought better of it, which was probably the right instinct. She got back in her buggy and drove back down the road. And Alara watched her go and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not satisfaction, not forgiveness in any complete sense. Just the particular quiet that came after a long-standing tension had been acknowledged and set down. Gideon appeared at the barn door. He'd seen the buggy and had clearly been waiting to see how it resolved. May Tilson, Alara said. I know her buggy. She came to apologize. He looked at her carefully. How do you feel about that? She considered it honestly. I feel like it happened 3 years too late, and I'm glad it happened anyway. She picked up the measuring rod she'd set down. That's as much as I can work out right now. He nodded. Fair enough. He went back into the barn, and she went back to the cistern, and the morning continued the way mornings did. The week before the first snowfall, the weather had been threatening it since mid-October and finally delivered on a Tuesday that started cold and stayed colder. Gideon asked her to walk the north pasture with him. It wasn't unusual. They walked sections of the property regularly, reading the land, checking the grass recovery, assessing what the season ahead would require. But there was something in the way he'd asked, a particular deliberateness, the words chosen rather than habitual, that she recognized as meaning this was about something else. The north pasture had changed since summer. The Dawes lease had ended 2 weeks prior, the sheep gone back to their home range, and the land showed the evidence of that occupation. The grass cropped differently than cattle would have cropped it, certain areas more heavily grazed, others barely touched. But underneath that, the recovery she'd been tracking since the rotation changes was visible. Real grass. Not a full stand. Nothing like what good land looked like in a good year, but actual root systems holding actual moisture. The pale, dead scrub of drought giving way in patches to something green and alive. It would take time, maybe 2 full seasons before the north pasture was carrying capacity again. But it was moving in the right direction, which was the only direction that mattered. They walked without talking for a while, the cold air clean and sharp, and carrying the smell of the first frost on the soil. Her coat wasn't quite warm enough, and she hadn't admitted that to herself until this moment, a minor discomfort she'd been filing under things to deal with later. I've been thinking about what you said, Gideon said, about some things not needing to be said immediately, to be real. She kept walking. I remember. I think we're past immediately. She stopped. He stopped too, a step ahead of her, and turned. The north pasture stretched behind him toward the ridge, The sky above it a pale winter gray with the particular flatness of a sky that had snow in it somewhere above the clouds. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her in the kitchen the night they'd made the mortgage current, with the directness of a man who'd decided to say the true thing even though the true thing cost something. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I want to say that clearly before I say anything else. I know you came here because you needed work, and I needed help. And I know what's grown from that is—" He paused. "I'm not eloquent. I don't have the words that make it sound better than it is, or more complicated than it is. What I know is that this ranch is alive, and I'm more myself than I've been since Clara died. And both of those things have your name on them." She looked at him. The cold was moving through her coat, and she felt it. Felt the ground under her feet, and the smell of the frost, and the particular weight of this moment that had been coming for a long time. "Clara," she said carefully. "Yes." He didn't look away. "She was my wife, and I loved her, and she's gone, and I've grieved her as honestly as I knew how. I'm not asking you to be her or replace her or fill a space she left. I'm asking you to be here because you are Alara Quinn, and I have spent the last 3 months understanding that the world goes better with you in it." He paused. "With me in it. My world." She was quiet for a moment. The honest thing. That was what she owed him, and what she owed herself. "I've been afraid of this," she said. "Of me?" "Of wanting something I could lose." She looked at the ridge beyond him, the familiar shape of it against the gray sky. "I lost the farm. I lost the legal case. I lost 3 years in Red Hollow to a story people told about me that had nothing to do with who I actually was. After a while, you start keeping everything at a certain distance because the closer it gets, the more it can take from you when it goes. I know that feeling," he said quietly. "I know you do." She looked at him. "That's part of what I'm afraid of. We're both people who've learned to protect ourselves from loss. And sometimes two people like that together just build a bigger wall and call it a life." He was quiet. She respected that he didn't immediately argue, that he considered it. "That's possible," he said. "I won't tell you it isn't." He looked at the pasture around them. "But I've also been standing in this field for 3 years protecting myself from loss, and what I mostly ended up with was alone." He looked back at her. "I'd rather try and be wrong than not try and know." The snow started while he was still talking. Not dramatically, a few flakes at first, the lightest possible introduction, drifting down through the cold air and landing on the grass and her coat and his hat. She looked up at the sky, at the gray giving way to something softer and white, and felt the cold of it on her face. She thought about her father's farm and the legal papers and the trunk with everything she owned and the hired room at the Callaway boarding house with the window facing the alley. She thought about the morning she'd pulled a handwritten notice off a nail outside Hennessy's general store and put it in her pocket. She thought about how sometimes the things that saved you didn't look like saving at the time. They looked like desperation, like the last option, like answering a notice posted by a man you'd never met on a piece of paper he'd written the address on in pencil. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again, more clearly. "I'm not leaving." Something changed in his face. Not a dramatic change. Gideon was not a man of dramatic expressions. A loosening. The release of a tension that had been held for so long it had almost become invisible. He reached out and she took his hand, cold fingers against cold fingers, and they stood in the north pasture of Iron Ridge Ranch, while the snow came down around them and settled on the recovering grass. It wasn't a perfect moment. Her coat was too thin and she was cold, and there were things between them that would take time to understand, and probably some that would never fully resolve, because that was how it went with real people. But it was real, which was the thing she'd been missing in Red Hollow for 3 years. Something that was hers, that she'd chosen, that had been built rather than handed to her. She held on to it. By December, the snow had settled in properly, the kind of winter that came to the territory with intention and stayed. Iron Ridge Ranch operated through it the way ranches did. Harder days, shorter light, the work shifting but not stopping. Alara had reorganized the winter feeding schedule to account for the hay stores, which were better than they'd been the previous year because she'd contracted an additional supplier in October when the prices were lower. The cattle were in reasonable condition, the core breeding herd intact, the north pasture resting under its cover of snow and recovering underneath. The Attorney General's investigation into crow lending was ongoing. She received a letter in November from the Territory Administration confirming that Silas Crow had been formally notified of the inquiry and that Crow Lending's operations had been placed under a voluntary compliance agreement pending the investigation's outcome. The practical meaning was that Crow was not foreclosing on anyone while investigators were reading his books. Gentry wrote from Millhaven that the Mercer case had been referred to the Territory Court as planned. The Mercer family had been located in the Eastern Territories and had engaged an attorney. Whether they would ultimately recover their property was still uncertain, but they were in the fight, which was more than they'd had in October. She wrote back to Gentry with her notes on the Halsey parcel, which she'd continued researching on her own time. She'd found an additional document in the county filings that she thought might be relevant. She wasn't sure it would matter, but she sent it anyway. One afternoon, in early December, Gideon found her at the kitchen table with the ledger open to a new section she'd started. A long-range financial plan for the ranch, built around the assumption of 2 full seasons of recovery and the potential rail line access and the breeding program she'd been developing on paper since October. He sat down across from her and looked at it for a long moment. "This is a 3-year plan," he said. "Yes." "You're planning 3 years out." She looked at him. "Is that a problem?" He shook his head slowly. Something in his face that she'd learned to read over the past months. The particular quality of a man allowing himself to believe in a future he'd been afraid to imagine. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." She turned the ledger back toward herself. "In year 2, if the North Pasture recovery continues at the current rate, you can add 20 head to the breeding stock. That puts you at a 60-head operation with a sustainable grazing rotation. Year 3, if the rail access comes through as projected—" "When you say you," Gideon said. She looked up. "You keep saying you can add 20 head, you can expand, you mean we." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the ledger, picked up the pencil, crossed out a word in the margin, and wrote another. "We," she said. He looked at the page. A quiet morning in December, snow on the ground outside and the ranch ticking along around them, and 2 people at a kitchen table building something on paper that they intended to build in the world. Red Hollow had a particular way of revising its memory. It didn't announce the revision or acknowledge that one had taken place. It simply began telling the story differently, incrementally, until the original version had been quietly retired and the new one took its place as if it had always been true. By the time winter had fully settled in, the story Red Hollow was telling about Elara Quinn had changed. The bad luck woman, the cursed stranger, the one nobody would hire. That story had been replaced, not cleanly or completely, but substantially, by a different one. The woman who'd gone to work at Iron Ridge and turned it around. The woman who'd gone to the courthouse on her own time and pulled out a pattern that nobody else had looked for and found the thread that unraveled Silas Crow's scheme. The woman who'd walked into a dying ranch and walked out with it alive. People stopped crossing the street when she came through town. May Tilson said hello and meant it. The man at the feed store, who had declined to extend credit to her twice in the past 3 years, asked about the ranch and whether she expected the herd to expand in the spring. She was polite to all of them. She wasn't warm, not immediately, not in the way of someone who'd forgotten what the previous 3 years had been. Trust was a thing that had to be rebuilt through action over time, and she was patient about it without being cold. She'd learned the difference between holding a grudge and maintaining a realistic appraisal, and she tried to do the latter. Berta Holt remained the person in Red Hollow she trusted most, which said something about character and something about consistency, and something about the value of a person who told you the truth without wrapping it in a presentation. They'd taken to having coffee together on Thursdays when Elara was in town, a habit that had started accidentally and become deliberate. "Do you feel differently here now?" Berta asked one Thursday in January, her hands around her cup. Elara thought about it honestly. "Yes and no," she said. "The town is treating me differently. That changes things practically. It doesn't change what I know about how quickly a community can turn on someone it's decided is inconvenient." "No," Berta agreed. "That's a thing once you know it. But I have something I didn't have before." Elara looked at the table. "I have ground. Actual ground, something I'm building on. And someone building it with me." She paused. "That changes the equation more than the town's opinion does." Berta looked at her with the quiet perceptiveness of a woman who had sorted a lot of other people's correspondence and could read between the lines of most things. "You look different than you did in the fall," she said. "I feel different." "Good different?" Alara thought about the north pasture under snow, the ledger with the 3-year plan, the cold morning with the first snowflakes, and a man who'd said, "I'd rather try and be wrong than not try and know." She thought about what it meant to stop running from the possibility of loss and stand still in a place long enough for it to become yours. "Yes," she said. "Good different." Tip. There was something she'd learned in the past year that she hadn't expected to learn, and she thought about it sometimes in the evenings when the ranch was quiet and she was writing in the ledger or reading the agricultural papers or sitting with Gideon in the kitchen with no particular agenda. The thing she'd learned was this: worthiness was not a fixed quality that some people had and others didn't. It was not dispensed or withheld by towns or circumstances or the judgment of people who didn't know you. It was demonstrated. It was built out of choices made consistently in the direction of what you believed rather than what was convenient. Red Hollow had decided she wasn't worth knowing. That decision said everything about Red Hollow and nothing about Alara Quinn, but she'd let it mean something about her anyway, for 3 years, in the small ways that accumulated into something that looked like resignation. The small table at the back of the boarding house dining room. The eyes cast down on Caldwell Street. The applications for work written in careful handwriting and slid under doors that never opened. She understood why she'd done that. When you had nothing backing you up, no family, no money, no community, no land, it was easy to start believing the story that you weren't worth backing up. Easy and wrong and entirely understandable. What had changed at Iron Ridge wasn't that the world had finally seen her clearly. The world was the world, and it would see what it chose to see for reasons that had little to do with her. What had changed was that she'd stopped waiting for the world to decide. She'd walked into a dying ranch with a borrowed horse and a ledger full of notes and done what she knew how to do, and the doing of it had produced something real. The ranch was alive. The scheme was exposed. The threat was dismantled. And the man who'd hired her because he was out of options had become the person she was building a life with. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been easy or inevitable. There had been nights when she'd lain awake working through problems that didn't have clear solutions, and mornings when the next step wasn't visible, and a kitchen table confrontation with a powerful man that had required every resource she had and left her shaking slightly in a way she hadn't let anyone see until she was alone. Real things were like that. They asked for everything you had and sometimes more, and the asking was the point. It was where you found out what you were made of. She was made of a lot of things she hadn't fully known before. Some of them were harder than she'd expected, and some were softer, and all of them were hers. On the last day of January, a letter arrived from the Territory Court regarding the Mercer case. The court had found the original foreclosure procedurally deficient. The Mercer family had 45 days to file for reinstatement of title to their property. She read it twice and then put it in an envelope with a note of her own and sent it to Gentry at the Millhaven Land Office, who would know how to make sure it reached the right people. She couldn't do more than that. But it was something. That evening, Gideon asked her what had come in the mail, and she told him, and he was quiet for a moment with that particular stillness she'd come to understand meant he was feeling something he was choosing not to perform. "They might get it back," he said. "They might." He nodded. He went back to the stove where something was cooking. She went back to the ledger. The fire in the wood stove was the only sound for a while, and outside the window the ranch was quiet under its winter cover. The cattle settled, the pastures resting, the land doing what land did when you gave it enough time and didn't ask too much of it all at once. She turned to the page with the 3-year plan, added a note in the margin about fencing costs for the spring expansion she'd been thinking about. Added another about contacting the Rail Commission in March to get the most current information on the corridor timeline. There was a lot of work ahead. There always was. That was the nature of a thing worth building. It didn't finish. It just deepened. The ranch would have good years and hard years and years where the rain came right and years where it didn't, and all of it would require attention and adjustment and the willingness to start over on the parts that failed and keep the parts that held. She was ready for that. Gideon set 2 plates on the table. She closed the ledger, moved it to the side. He sat down across from her in the chair that had become his chair in the way things became yours through repetition and choice, And they ate dinner in the warmth of the kitchen while the January cold pressed against the windows and found no way in. Iron Ridge Ranch stood in the last of the winter light, solid on its foundations. And the woman who had been invisible in Red Hollow for 3 years sat inside it and knew, with the particular clarity of something earned rather than given, that she was exactly where she belonged.